What's up guys, my name is Ace, and Season 2 of Battlefield 6 is finally here, and in today's video, we're going to be diving deep into the weapon balancing that took place with this update. Keeping in mind, we kind of went over this a little bit when they first released the patch notes on Friday, but obviously, at that point, we didn't have the update, so I couldn't test before and after, and I like showing you guys exactly what changed. And today's video is even going to include a full recoil test for all of the primary weapons in the game. And without further ado, let's dive right into this and start it off with some of the miscellaneous changes to some individual guns. And the first thing is a rate of fire boost to the DB12 shotgun. And in the menus, it states our rate of fire went from 126 rounds per minute up to 150 rounds per minute. However, this gun doesn't have a standard rate of fire. It'll fire 2 shells quite quickly in semi-auto, then you have to pump it, so there's a pump delay, until you can fire your next 2 rounds, and then you just repeat that process. And so based on my hand testing at least, our 2-shot rate of fire pre-patch was roughly 200 rounds per minute, and now it's roughly 360 rounds per minute, so very noticeably faster between those 2 shots that you fire. Then for our pump animation, keeping in mind this applies after the fire time of the second shot has fired, this went from roughly 550 milliseconds down to roughly 467 milliseconds, meaning for a 2-shot kill, previously we were killing in 200 milliseconds, now we can kill in 167 milliseconds, and for a 3-shot kill where you have to pump in between, previously it was 950 milliseconds to kill, now it's just over 800 milliseconds to kill. So definitely a noticeable improvement here to the DB12. Next, in the DMR category, the LMR 27 saw a couple damage buffs, which notably don't impact our shots to kill to the body at all. It's still going to be a 4-shot kill at any range. However, this damage boost affects how our headshots work. And as you can see, when not using any special ammo type, pre-patch, at any range, we needed to mix 3 headshots in order to get a 3-shot kill. So literally every bullet had to hit the head. Now we can get a 3-shot kill at any range if 2 of those shots hit the head and 1 of the shots hits the body. So it's definitely a bit more forgiving there for base headshots. However, with hollow point, now from 0 to 21.25 meters, we just need 1 headshot mixed in with 2 body shots to get a 3-shot kill, so that makes hollow point that much more powerful. However, at a distance beyond 21.25 meters, hollow point isn't giving you a headshot advantage. You still need to mix 2 headshots in with a body shot for a 3-shot kill. And this is where synthetic rounds come in. If you use synthetic ammo on this, now at any range, you just need to mix 1 headshot in with 2 body shots to get a 3-shot kill. So in my opinion at least, synthetic is the obvious choice here on this gun if you've got it unlocked. And this is actually going to be very noticeably better, especially at longer ranges when using that, as long as you're hitting headshots. If you're not hitting headshots, this gun is exactly the same as it was before. Well, outside of the fact that there were some blanket recoil adjustments, which we'll have a look at really soon here, and on top of that, they also fixed a bug where the fast mags on this gun weren't giving you faster reloads, and now they are. Now finally, for the miscellaneous balancing adjustments they made here, the Mini Scout Sniper Rifle saw a couple adjustments. The first thing is our muzzle velocity was reduced from 880 meters per second down to 800 meters per second. And then the only other thing they did here is they reduced our arm multiplier to now match our lower torso multiplier, so the lower amount of damage. So it's actually going to be a little bit less forgiving with dealing that bonus body damage. However, realistically, unless that player is already hurt, you likely won't notice any difference because it's going to be a 2-shot kill to the body at any range, anywhere in the body anyway. So you might be dealing less damage, but you're still getting a 2-shot kill. And there we have it. That wraps it up for the individual weapon changes that were made here. Now let's get into the overall recoil changes. And they did mention there were some blanket changes to how they handle recoil in general. And then they also pointed out a handful of specific weapons that saw either nerfs or buffs to their recoil. And we're going to be looking at both today. So let's just start this off with the assault rifle category. And here are all of the pre-patch versus post-patch recoil plots. Keeping in mind, all of these were tested with a mouse and keyboard. And controller players will be seeing a 25% reduction to recoil, but not spread. And then as I go through this, I'm just going to highlight in green or red which of these was stated to have a buff or nerf. So green is going to be a buff, red is going to be a nerf, just to help guide this a little bit more so you can see what was meant to be changing here. So in this case, the M433 was meant to see a buff, and you can see there's a lot more consistency there. It's not bouncing side to side nearly as much as it's kicking up and to the right. So a lot more consistency there. Then for the B36, it does appear that it's got less horizontal drift overall. And with the SOAR 556, interestingly, while they stated that the recoil should be improved, honestly, post-patch is looking very slightly worse than pre-patch based on my tests that I've done here. At the end of the day, still a very accurate gun, but I'm at least not seeing a major difference here, and definitely not a very noticeable improvement by any means. And then finally, for the specific stated changes, the L85 was meant to see a buff, and we can see it seems to have less horizontal recoil. It's kicking almost straight upward now, instead of having that notable lean to the left. So again, those are the ones that were specifically mentioned in the patch notes, but as I said, they also just mentioned there were some blanket changes, and one thing I want to point out here, for instance, is the TR7. While it wasn't picked out specifically as having worse recoil, post-patch is definitely looking like it's bouncing around quite a bit more than pre-patch. So even if something wasn't specifically highlighted because it was singled out in the patch notes, it doesn't mean nothing has necessarily changed with it when it comes to recoil. In either case, let's move into the Carbine category, and here are all the recoil plots. And they did mention the M277, the M417, the QBZ192, and the SOAR 300C were all meant to see buffs, whereas the SG553R was meant to see a nerf. And then finally, with the AK205, they were a bit vague in the patch notes as to whether it was going to be seeing a buff or a nerf. If you look at these stat bars, the control value has gone down, so that leads me to believe that this was actually meant to be a nerf. And looking at it post-patch, like, it might be very slightly more recoil than previously, but it still appears to be a pinpoint accurate gun. One thing I do want to mention here, though, is the M277, it actually looks worse post-patch compared to pre-patch, despite the fact that it was supposed to be seeing a buff. So that's just something that I found to be interesting there. Now, after that, let's have a look at our SMG recoil adjustments. And 3 of the SMGs in particular were meant to see nerfs. These are the SGX, the PW5A3, and the SCW10. And while I'm definitely seeing a little bit of a higher magnitude to the recoil on the SGX, with the PW5, that looks almost identical to pre-patch. I guess you could argue there's just slightly more recoil there, but I mean, that's still going to be a very accurate gun based on what I'm seeing here. Whereas with the SCW10, there is definitely a little bit more randomness mixed in, so it should be harder to hit those melty kills at longer ranges. And then on top of that, they did mention for buffs, the PW7A2 and the USG90 were meant to see a net buff here, but they mentioned they adjusted recoil behavior on these to improve effectiveness at range while slightly increasing handling difficulty up close. So I'm not entirely sure what they meant by their wording there, but based on what I'm seeing here, it looks like they're climbing a little bit higher, so they have a bit more of a higher magnitude of vertical recoil. But there does appear to be less randomness and side-to-side bounce, especially with the USG90 compared to pre-patch. So I believe that's what they mean by this. They have less horizontal recoil and a little more vertical recoil. Then when it comes to LMGs, these are all the recoil plots I've got for you guys. And in the patch notes, they only stated the L110 and the M123K saw some recoil improvements here. And they definitely look a little bit better, at least post-patch compared to pre-patch. Especially in the case of the L110, it does appear there's less side-to-side bounce as it's kicking upward, so that should make it quite a bit more controllable at least. Whereas for all the rest, they all look at least pretty similar to pre-patch. No major differences to note at least. And then finally for recoil, I wanted to take a look at DMRs. Even though none of these were singled out as seeing any recoil changes, when looking at all of them though, they all appear to have reduced recoil across the board. They're not kicking up nearly as much. They have the same general recoil behavior in all cases. Like if there's a big first shot jump pre-patch, you're still seeing that jump post-patch, but everything's just compressed a little bit. So it does appear all of the DMRs are just a little more accurate after this update. And there we have it. That's going to wrap it up for all of the weapon balancing, including all of the new recoil plots for the primary weapons at least in Battlefield 6. And when it comes to my thoughts on all of this, I definitely think there were some nice improvements there. One thing I wanted to mention, I really like what they did with the LMR 27, where they just improved the headshot effectiveness, and I feel like they could do so much more here when it comes to many of the other guns in the game. Maybe some of the underperforming guns in the other categories. Instead of giving them massive buffs, maybe just adjust their damage values enough to have an impact on headshots specifically to give them that little bit of an edge in that one specific area over the others in the same category. I think that would make weapon balancing a whole lot more interesting, and I think there's a lot of room for them to be doing things like that. Now, of course, those are just my opinions, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about this weapon balancing overall in those comments down below. And also, just in general, for those of you guys that have been playing the season so far, what are your early impressions? Are you guys generally happy, or maybe not so much? If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.